Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider Indianapolis Star. It is pretty late in the evening, closing in on 10:45 on November 20th, Monday, November 20th. Just kind of an insider video wrapping up Indiana's two-game swing here in New York. Obviously, a stop at the Empire Classic that probably leaves a fair bit of consternation kind of surrounding IU basketball heading forward. I think the biggest thing that sort of stuck out to me, Mike Woodson said after the Yukon game that he was anxious to get to that game. He wanted to know where his team stacked up. He wanted to see his team against a good team. And listen, I think he could have seen some of the struggles of the first three games and understood where Indiana was, but he wanted to see Indiana against a really good team in Yukon and kind of understand what worked, what didn't, all that. And actually, I don't know that Indiana deserved to lose that game by fewer points than it did. It reminded me a lot of the Arizona game last year, where for a long stretch of the game, Indiana was at very least sort of competitive. But there was only kind of one team ever in control of the game. Only one team ever really looked like winning the game. And if you remember that Arizona game, Indiana would kind of make these little runs, these little sort of 5-7 point bursts that would kind of pull Arizona back, and maybe it would get it down from 12 points to 5 points or 13 points to 7 points. And you would feel like Indiana was maybe kind of one more score sequence away from really getting the game going again. And there were 3 or 4 of those moments distinctly in the Yukon game. And just like that Arizona game last year, Indiana just never turned those into anything. I think that the big one was that sequence that looked like, I think Indiana was down, I want to say 5, and they got a stop, they got a rebound, they were headed back up the floor, and Xavier Johnson, kind of in his haste to try and make something happen, try and make a play, and really sort of capitalize on this building momentum for Indiana, because I think they were on a 6 or a 7-0 run. Instead of kind of pulling it out and not trying to drive through the pressure, he tried to split 2 Yukon players. One of them poked it away in a loose ball. Yukon player picked it up, went up to the rim, and Malik Renew drew either his 4th or his 5th foul. I can't remember which one it was. Forgive me. I've seen a lot of basketball in the last couple of days. But it just sort of felt like that was kind of a moment that was indicative of, every time Indiana was on the cusp in that game, Yukon found a way to push them back. And eventually, Renew fouled out. You felt like Indiana kind of disengaged with the game, and that's where you got the final score. But, we could talk about the individual successes and failures of this weekend, or, however you want to classify it, Sunday, Monday, into Thanksgiving week. It felt like the Yukon game was Mike Woodson's sort of, look at rawest, hardest look at where Indiana is, what's good, what's bad, what needs fixing, what can be fixed. And just kind of an opportunity to try and build forward from there. I think, that probably the biggest talking points coming out of this are Mackenzie Mgbako, 3-point shooting, to some extent just guard play in Indiana's offense in general. I think, Mike Woodson had a quote, as he's wont to do, his sometimes colorful language. He said he's a young player, man. All you guys expect him to be this great player right now because he's got this 5-star tag on him. I think that's bullshit. The bottom line is he's still young and he's trying to learn. And then later he said he'll be fine. I think it's, publicly anyway, I think that's the approach Woodson's going to take with Mgbako, is he's just going to say, he's going to protect his player. And I don't think that's the wrong thing. I think that's probably the right thing. And, there is probably at least an extent to which Woodson has a point. Mgbako just turned 18. Not every guy kind of clicks into place right away. There's plenty of examples throughout kind of, basketball. Kalel Ware in Indiana is a great example of a player that went to Oregon with really, really high expectations last year and just never really found his comfort zone. And Indiana's going to persist with Mackenzie Mgbako, I suspect. But, I don't think Indiana's going to place the expectations on him. Maybe they're there externally. I think the big question with Mgbako is, to me, just a question of lineups in general, which is, for actually a long time, I guess, just to, pull back the curtain or whatever. That's sort of a formal phrase, but on kind of my thought process when I build out sort of what I'm going to write for my insider for a long time on Monday, I was thinking about writing something basically advocating for the idea that Indiana just plays a lot smaller, that Indiana's lineups tend to work better defensively when they play smaller. They play with 3 guards or 2 guards and maybe a more agile wing like a Caleb Banks, and that Indiana should just kind of go to a tight 4-5 rotation of Kalel Ware Malik Renew and Mackenzie Mgbako. Two would start, one would come off the bench. They would all play like 30 minutes a night, 28, 30 minutes, a little bit of room in there for Peyton Sparks. But that those three would just kind of really run through the 4 and the 5, and that would be what Indiana did. And then Indiana goes to this zone that I think held Louisville to maybe like one field goal in the last 9 minutes. Indiana went to the zone at 7 minutes left, down 5, and from there outscored Louisville 19-4, I think, 19-6. And some of that was Louisville's inability to adjust to the zone, but you saw how effective those bigger lineups can be for Indiana when they do go to that zone, because even though Indiana really wasn't doing anything particularly creative in the zone, and it was clear, frankly, that they'd only sort of done, put in a bare bones kind of 2-3, there wasn't, they didn't even look super comfortable in it, to be honest with you, the way Khalil Ware was moving in the middle and, kind of how rotations were around the corners. It still, you were just reminded how well they rebounded out of it, how well they defended and contested shots. There was one time where I think Caleb Banks just pulled in a lob on the backside. They're just so long and athletic that if you put them in that zone, it works better because every one of those guys is either quick enough or long enough to cover more ground. And it simplifies some things defensively. And as long as you don't get torched from behind the 3-point line, and as long as you don't just get killed on the glass, there are ways in which I think that zone can work for Indiana, but only if you're playing the bigger lineups. And so I think that one of the things Mike Woodson leaves New York with is this question of basically just what does his best rotation look like, or what do his best rotations look like? There are games where his starters are the better players. There are games where his reserves. Today, his reserves really kind of saved him against Louisville. There are days where, frankly, the big lineups don't work. There are days when, and I would argue this was certainly the case against Yukon, and to some extent even the case against Louisville when you look at, ultimately where Indiana winds up in this game. 4 players in double figures in scoring. And those 4 players are Xavier Johnson, Khalil Ware, Malik Renew, Anthony Walker. So 3 of your 4 players in double figures you classify as forwards. The big lineups worked. They worked in the first half with guys coming off the bench. Peyton Sparks also had 9 points. And they worked in the second half when you went to that zone, and you needed that length. You needed that reach. You needed that wingspan to clog things up and kind of keep Louisville stretched out and just constantly going sort of wide on the perimeter rather than attacking the spaces and attacking attacking essentially the soft spots in the zone. They were afraid to do it because Indiana could just put, hands in passing lanes. So I think that's that's probably the second thing Mike Woodson sort of leaves with, is just trying to figure out, what he wants out of his rotation, who fits where, and to some extent, whether he needs to re-examine maybe not necessarily the roles of some guys, because again, like if you wanted to play a smaller lineup with Mgbako at the 4, you could play him off the bench and still play him 25 to 30 minutes a night, but you'd have to commit to the idea that you're going to play essentially a 3-guard lineup, and that it's going to be some mixture of Galloway, Johnson, Cups, Banks, Gunn, maybe Leal in those 3 guard spots, and then for those 2 forward spots, you're going to keep a pretty tight rotation of Mgbako, Renew, and Ware with a little bit of Peyton Sparks and or Anthony Walker mixed in. And if you did that, I think you'd be better in man-to-man defense, but you'd probably be giving some things up in rebounding. You certainly wouldn't be able to make the impact you did with the zone on Monday, and to sort of lead into the third thing for Indiana. I mean, Indiana has now hit 15 threes in 5 games this season. They are 15 of, if I'm doing my math right here, 64, which is obviously an abysmal number. They're not taking a lot of threes. They're not hitting a lot of threes. You can accept not shooting well at Madison Square Garden. You can kind of live with that, even if it's over 2 games, and they were only 4 of 24 in these 2 games. But Indiana's best 3-point shooting game all season was against Army. They shot 36.4%. That was a 4 for 11 game. They haven't shot 31% in a game other than that one all season, and they haven't taken more than 16 threes in a single game yet this year. And so for all kind of this discussion of like offensive revolution and Indiana's going to do something different, in the sort of post-Trace Jackson-Davis era, to be honest, we're just kind of seeing a version of Indiana that we saw last year with maybe, slightly less seasoned and less dominant players. So that's kind of, I think, the last thing Woodson is probably going to leave New York wondering about, is just kind of how he fixes this team's shooting woes. I don't think we can expect them to take a high volume of threes. They haven't at any point in Woodson's tenure, and I don't think they've got the personnel to do that, but they've at least got to hit more. they've got to get to a place where more of the open ones are going down. And maybe that doesn't happen in a Madison Square Garden, but it certainly at least needs to happen at Assembly Hall, and it hasn't yet this season. So, I think that the closing lines of my insider tonight, I talked a lot about the zone. The closing lines of my insider tonight were basically just, Mike Woodson is clearly still searching for what works with this team. It may never find that. It may never find what it needs to become the best version of itself, or a version of itself that can make an NCAA tournament, or, make noise in the Big Ten, etc. But it's not dead yet. And I think that's the one thing that probably Woodson would be telling his players is, listen, we're still 4-1. It's not a very pretty 4-1. It hasn't been a particularly hope-inspiring 4-1. But Indiana is 4-1. And if Indiana can beat Harvard on Sunday in Indianapolis in a game they'll be favored in, although perhaps not by much right now, Ken Palm only has them by 6 points, then you get to a stretch where it's Maryland at home, it's Michigan, it's Auburn on a neutral site, and it's Kansas at home. And if you can find your way to winning any one of those games, then that's probably feels like something to build on for Indiana. And I don't know if this sounds like me trying to, polish what's left in the bathroom or not. I don't think anybody is ignorant to how bad Indiana has looked over these first 5 games. And as I said in my insider, it may not get better. It genuinely may not get better. But I do think there are still windows where this team, like the last 6.5, 7 minutes of Sunday's game against an admittedly bad Louisville team, there are still windows when this team looks like it can be something competitive and functional at the level that it believes it can perform at. And I think it'll be fascinating, because a lot of people will talk about Mike Woodson and they'll say one of the best things he is in as a coach in basketball is a teacher. He's going to have a lot of time here between now and the new year to teach, to learn, to grow, to figure it out with these players. It's going to be fascinating to see if he can do it. We'll be there for every step of the way. For now, I'm going to get some sleep, and then I'm going to catch a flight home tomorrow and have a little Thanksgiving dinner with my family. I hope you all do the same. We'll be back for the bucket game on Saturday in West Lafayette, and then obviously the basketball game in Indianapolis against Harvard at Cambridge Fieldhouse on Sunday afternoon. Between now and then, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Hope you've enjoyed this dispatch from a downtown New York hotel room. We'll talk to you soon.